Since my goal with this channel is to help people use political psychology to improve the world around them, the question I'm focusing on is social media useful for activists? I will go ahead and spoil the surprise, although the video thumbnail likely already did that. The answer to is social media useful to activists is yes, but with a big old asterisk. There are a lot of fascinating and potentially useful nuances associated with that yes, so you should keep watching. You should also keep watching to get the insights of my wonderful guest for today, Dr. Matt Motil, formerly of Meta, currently of the USC Marshall Neely Center for Ethical Leadership and Decision Making and the Integrity Institute. Let's get some of his thoughts on the usefulness of social media and activism now.
It's not always the case that when people are participating in some kind of cause online that it translates to offline action, but it can.
Welcome or welcome back to Political-psych-abby, a channel where I talk about the psychology of politics and try to throw in the occasional joke. In my experience, those who are the most dismissive of all online activism tend to think that it's all just slacktivism. And that's why I think it's important that we address slacktivism first in this video. Oxford Languages defines it as the practice of supporting a political or social cause by means such as social media or online petitions, characterized as involving very little effort or commitment. I think this is a nice, clear, concise definition, but it doesn't quite capture the derision with which the term is typically used. One of the academic articles I read on this topic cites Urban Dictionary for their definition, and I mean, if it's good enough for a prestigious academic journal, it's good enough for YouTube. The Urban Dictionary definition is the act of participating in obviously pointless activities as an expedient alternative to actually expending effort to fix a problem. So, first, I want to explore how much of social media activism is slacktivism versus how much is real activism. I think to be full on slacktivism, an action has to have three aspects. It has to be low effort, it has to detract from IRL activism. This one is hard to measure, and it has to be useless, which is unfortunately also hard to measure. I do think that there is a spectrum of slacktivism, and that something can have some slacktivism elements while still being somewhat effective activism. Primarily, in that something being low effort or purely online does not necessarily mean it'll have no impact. We can pretty conclusively say that not all social media activism is low effort. While much of the literature on social media and politics focuses on lower effort actions, as these are more common, and I would say maybe easier to focus on in a laboratory or survey setting, some authors also highlight the production of high effort content by activists for social media. Hopefully, this doesn't come off as defensive, but I do want to take a sec to share my experiences as the social media team lead for a volunteer organization. This role really resembles a job in a lot of ways. It involves meetings, forms, spreadsheets, graphic design, people management, and Slack. Not like slacking off, like Slack, the productivity tool. Don't feel too bad for me. I like the graphic design bit and the people I work with. I also like spreadsheets, although I may be insane. Look at the spreadsheet I made to plan Thanksgiving dinner. Now, I only spend a handful of hours a week on this volunteer role, but it's still a very different thing than the occasional heart or retweet. And of course, a lot of bigger organizations have full time social media people on the payroll, which I would be open to doing as a job. Hint, hint, if any hiring managers for organizations working on worthy causes happen to be hiring and watching. So we can pretty clearly say not all social media activism constitutes slacktivism, even if we are defining it based purely on effort. So now let's talk about whether the opportunities social media affords for people to engage in low effort activism actually decrease other activism. I'm going to be mostly referring to an analysis of the existing literature by Grijanis et al. Here. They focus on three possible relationships between offline and online activism. Digital dualism, meaning that online and offline protests are unrelated. Slacktivism, meaning a negative relationship between online and offline activism. And a positive correlation between online and offline activism. Slacktivism has the most fun name, so let's start with that. The authors describe the evidence to support it as mixed, and while this negative relationship is occasionally found, it's not very common and tends to be situationally specific. In other words, it's not the default. The authors also bring up some specific examples of distancing between online and offline protests. One example they bring up is online activists intentionally distancing themselves from IRL rioting. But to me, that seems less like stereotypical slacktivism and more like self preservation and image management.
Yeah. So my hunch is that online activism or slacktivism or hashtag activism, whatever you want to call it, it's not detracting from offline activism because the people that only engage online are probably less convicted and less energized and enthusiastic about the cause. Like they probably have some kind of personal tie to it, maybe like family members or friends, they care about it. So they'll provide that kind of social signal or that virtue signal, like, oh, hey, thumbs up, I support this cause online. But uh, they're doing that for a reason other than really that they're passionate about that cause. They're doing it for social glue, social functions,
Yeah.
rather than like accomplishing a political end. Now, the people that are heavily involved offline and are being activists in like the traditional sense of the word, like picketing and marching and such in the streets, those people are certainly going to be involved or active online, but they're also active offline, regardless of whether online exists. So I don't think that the social media component or these online tools that can facilitate these coordination efforts of these groups would have any negative effect on the participation of people that are highly convicted and highly motivated to like push for these causes. So on balance, my guess is that social media probably slightly increases the number of people that participate in offline collective action or political action because there are a lot of people that might not know about these events. They might care a lot about the cause, but they don't know, like, oh, there's a rally going on down the street from where I live, or, oh, there's this protest or this event, a fundraiser maybe, that they could go to. And because social media often provides a way to like discover these kinds of things, I think that could increase their probability of going, because if they don't know that something's happening, then obviously they can't go.
Yeah. So now let's talk digital dualism. There are seemingly some people in a lot of movements who engage only in online activism or only in offline activism. However, I think that it's important to point out that even if someone is restricting themselves as an individual purely to online activism, they could still be encouraging others to engage in offline activism or changing norms in the real world. People do sometimes change their opinions or actions based on how many other people they think believe in or do a certain thing. And social media does impact these perceptions. Peer pressure is an incredible thing. This is a bit of a digression, but I honestly think we as a culture vilify peer pressure too much. Yes, people get pressured into doing horrible things, but they can also get pressured into doing good things. Too often, we assume that our individual instincts and thoughts are beyond reproach when we don't really have any good reason to think that we are wiser than the crowd. I go into way more detail about this in my video on the psychology of solidarity. Peer pressure can also be positive on social media in a political context. Bond et al. Found that Facebook users who saw a message about voting accompanied by the pictures of Facebook friends who indicated they had voted were significantly more likely to later indicate they had voted compared to people who just saw the message about voting with no social component. In other words, thinking your friends voted will likely encourage you to vote. And social media platforms like Facebook are able to facilitate this positive civic engagement. It is also becoming increasingly difficult to separate offline and online. Even if we separate social media conceptually from the rest of the internet, a lot of organizing can take place on social media platforms that provides material as well as rhetorical support to offline activism, legislation change. So now let's talk about whether social media boosts activism overall.
I don't know that social media increases activism in the real world. I generally don't think that social media or most new technologies have some kind of a qualitative, like transformative effect on people or the world. Instead, I think that the technologies are absorbed into existing processes and the existing ways that people interact and navigate their world. So when it comes to like political activism and collective action, I think that social media is kind of like the next wave of communication. And much like there was like radio before it, and after that there were like telephones and these kinds of things, it's just another way for people to communicate with each other. And with that, that reduces the collective coordination and collective action problems that exist when you can't communicate across distance or communicate in real time when you're on the move, which was not possible for a long time with just phones. So I think that social media and a lot of the new technology, it enables better coordination across time and space and can facilitate offline collective action and protest and activism, but not necessarily so.
All else being equal, is it useful for an activist campaign to utilize social media, or is it more nuanced than that?
As an academic at heart, you can't give me the opportunity to just go off with the easy out of saying, oh, there's nuance. Of course there's nuance. And it certainly depends on the context and a lot of the situational factors. But in general, I would say that it's pretty clear that the better communication that people in different groups have, the more likely they are to succeed in their activities. And some have speculated that that's why Homo sapiens have evolved and survived longer than some less communicative primates. So communication is key. And if you have two different campaigns for two different sides of an issue, and one is much more effective at using social media than the other, the one that is more effective at using social media is going to win out. And like, it's not exactly activism, but you can look at the last several presidential cycles where the political party that had the better online apparatus and the better online game, they won.
Okay, so now we know that social media can boost activism. Does it boost good activism or bad activism? That's definitely an overly simplistic question, so I guess sorry for that. It is pretty obvious that activism for all sorts of causes occurs on social media. We've seen everything from civil rights protests to ethnic cleansing spurred on by social media. Categorizing the role of social media in every movement everywhere, or even just in one country, and then categorizing those movements as good or bad is so beyond the scope of this video that it borders on impossible. So instead, I want to try and explore the more general nature of the beast. It may be best to view each social media website as its own beast, governed by an algorithm, a user base, and all too often forgotten, a corporation. It is worth noting, however, that several of these beasts behave similarly. Can you tell I just got back from visiting my cousin who studies animal behavior? She studies hamsters. Why did I choose people again? Just kidding. I chose because I actually really like people and I think they're really interesting. I guess I'm just weird like that. Anyway, back to social media. There are certain patterns of what tends to gain more traction in terms of online activism. Emotionality tends to do well on social media. To quote Rathje et al., several studies have found that social media posts containing moral or emotional words such as hate or blame tend to be shared 15 to 20% more in the context of online political debates among ordinary citizens and political elites, and across several countries. Understandably, a lot of people find this bias towards negativity in politics concerning. Matt has a really interesting nuanced take on this that I'll let him share with you now.
I don't think people are actually more negative when they talk about politics in general. It's certainly possible to be positive and talk in non-negative ways about things that we care about, especially if we're talking to people that maybe agree with us or are trying to learn about some issue that we know a lot about. So I think that those political conversations can be quite positive and not necessarily as negative and horrible as maybe the stereotype that we have of political dialogue is. So there is a very clear, demonstrable bias in the media, both mass media, historical mass media, and on social media, where the old slogan goes, if it bleeds, it leads. So newsrooms and newspapers, that they've long prioritized those stories because people get excited about that. And I don't know if it's like some appeal of like the gallows or some kind of way of like vicariously defending against like some of the existential angst that we may have. But people do have a bias to like stop and look at the train wreck over stopping and looking at the train as it goes by perfectly normally, like it always does. There, like the negativity bias is pretty well documented. And the other part that I think has really exaggerated this tendency is both on online newspapers and on social media, what we see is that the metrics are such that like there's a very clear gain in terms of the amount of time people spend with their eyes hovering over an article or an article title that is more negative than more positive. They're also more likely to share content that has angry words in them. They're also more likely to share things that are like misleading and divisive. So this is the stuff that is like problematic. And what we know about how most social technologies work and most social media platforms work to date is that they use a thing called engagement-based ranking. These engagement-based models essentially are built to show you more of the stuff that they think that you will like or that you will engage with. I should be very careful to not say stuff you'll like, but rather stuff you'll engage with, because most of these companies' business model is they need you to be on the platform so they can get more data on you and then target ads to you better. Now, what that means is like they don't care what that content is at the end of the day. Ultimately, it's just about how much time are you spending, how long are you scrolling on their feed, and how much data can they get from you while you're doing that. Now, what that means is the stuff that gets the most engagement is going to get, like, it's a cycle. So you see something bad, you engage with it, and then you're teaching the algorithm, oh, this person likes that. They're engaging it. So we need to show them more of that.
Still, there are negative implications to simply having algorithms downplay anger and negativity. In the course of researching this video, I read a really interesting paper by Spring, Cameron, and Sakara called The Upside of Outrage. In that paper, the authors point out that outrage can be an important motivator for people to help each other, especially when it's costly to do so. Essentially, that it can be good to get righteously pissed off.
I think that it's not hard to make the case that there's a positive anger and a negative anger. Now, when I think of positive anger, I'm thinking of anger that is like providing social support and connection with other people that have lived through some kind of bad event with you. And like after the killing of George Floyd, there are a lot of Black Americans, especially, like they were obviously like and very sensibly upset about that and angry about that because it's terrible. And on social media, like a lot of people would react with anger when they would see stories about Derek Chauvin and some of the others there, or other people in similar kinds of events. But generally, that anger that they're expressing, particularly when it's like within an in-group and they're not angry at the person posting, like the story about a person in their community being killed, they're angry that a person in their community was killed. If you post something online and I don't like the thing that you posted, I don't like that the thing that you posted existed or happened. Like I might react with anger on your post, but it is more me signaling to you like, oh, I can't believe that happened. That's terrible. I'm really upset about that. It's not me saying, oh, I'm so angry at you, Abby, for sharing this. And that type of anger, I think it serves a social glue function where it can connect people and help people provide social support to other people that are suffering through some kind of a travesty or tragedy. Oftentimes when looking at injustices in society, like they're not usually tied to just a specific individual, because like even though somebody might have committed a horrible crime or stole a bunch of money or done some bad thing, they're not just a bad apple. It's not like, oh, this is just that one person. Oh, he's at it again. No, if a system reliably is creating behaviors that are harmful or upsetting to a group, it makes sense that that group would be angry towards that system and want to overturn it or overthrow it. And oftentimes that's kind of what you see in like the like political revolutions, where like you have some underclass that's been oppressed or mistreated or robbed or whatever for a long enough period of time that their frustrations just mount and mount and mount. And eventually they get to a point where they try to have a revolution, or that maybe they organize a coup. Potentially that's not the worst thing in the world to happen, because some dictators are really terrible. Many dictators, if not all dictators, are probably really terrible. So overthrowing them is not necessarily a bad thing. We can look at revolutions over the last 15, 20 years, like in the Arab Spring. There's some debate about the role that technology played in it and how important it was in it, but I don't think I've seen any compelling arguments that say that it wasn't at least a part of the story, because a lot of the people that lived in, say, Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Syria and some of the other Arab Spring states, like they lived under pretty brutal dictators for a long time. They lived in systems where the government would take their money, not protect them, and then if they said anything bad about it, they might throw them in jail, they might kill them. And that's infuriating, because you don't have control over your own life. You don't even have power there, and you're always on edge, because like if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time, that could be the end of it. So like that frustration built enough, but I think in some ways the restrictions on speech made it hard for people to communicate and coordinate across the space to actually take action against somebody like Muammar Gaddafi. And I think that social media and some of these social communication technologies, they facilitated this, because you could have end-to-end encrypted messaging on Telegram or WhatsApp or Signal or other things that people use. And it's harder for the government to intercept that. And governments have become more savvy in more recent years at shutting down internet, like the whole internet or specific parts of the internet. And in doing so, that's kind of like one of the counter reactions that we see. Like, okay, so there are some of these revolutions that were facilitated by social media and social communication services, but now, like the government's like, oh my goodness, if we don't take action now, these people, they might revolt and throw us out of power. So in some countries, you're now seeing much quicker, drastic action, just like shutting off the internet.
How can it best be made so that the sort of mobilization that puts people in danger unnecessarily, powers ethnic cleansings, that kind of thing, how can that mobilization be reduced while simultaneously not decreasing the mobilization that needs to happen?
Yeah, and like this is a really hard problem.
Yeah.
You probably could win a Nobel Peace Prize if you figure it out.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting a simple answer to this one.
Now, there are lots of different ways that this could be done, and we did do work on some of these in my time when I was at Meta, particularly after the George Floyd killing, where and Mark Zuckerberg made some public statements about like trying to demote angry political content, and there were a lot of layers to this, but essentially the effort was to differentiate the positive and negative types of anger that we talked about earlier. Essentially, can we figure out what kind of anger people don't want versus the kind of anger that they do want? We could map this to be like, okay, the anger that people don't want to see in their feeds might be like the stuff that is like attacking them or people that they care about or things that they care about, or like just kind of mean, nasty, hateful stuff, versus like this kind of showing social support or solidarity with people that are suffering through something. Now, this is not an easy thing to differentiate, but if you can come up with a coding scheme such that people could look at different pieces of content or listen to different takes and then say, all right, this is positive and this is negative. If you can get evaluators to reliably and consistently differentiate these different types of anger, then it just becomes another equation or just another like variable within your model. So like you can imagine the long ranking algorithm formula where it's like, oh, probability of like, oh, then multiply by 1.1. But here it's like probability of it being unwanted anger or negative anger. Oh, let's multiply that by 0.9. It's less than 1.
Yeah.
So it'll demote it in the feed. So like computationally and methodologically, it's not hard to accomplish, but the conceptual problem is the real issue. Like, how do we label like good from bad when it comes to these very subjective things? And ultimately, that's where we got stuck.
Yeah, and I feel like the good and bad might be different to society as a whole than it is to a specific social media company.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like the companies are embedded within countries, and those countries are embedded within like economic groups and economic zones, and like the end users of those platforms are worth different amounts of money to those companies depending on where they live in the world, like what the country's GDP per capita is, like those kinds of things. So when thinking about it in that light, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like good for whom, bad for whom. And when I'm saying good and bad, I'm just saying like this, like the positive type of anger versus the negative type of anger that we've been discussing. But I think that like a similar like value proposition exists for lots of different issues. We just happen to be talking about anger.
Something like, if we're talking about, movement for a very high tax on billionaires, that might be something that a lot of people are fine seeing in their feed, but that a hypothetical billionaire owner of a social media company does not want people to be seeing, which is tricky.
And if these hypothetical billionaires have really strong opinions on something like that, they might do something like change the algorithm so that you don't see any posts from regular users that are talking about it. But if they pay a certain amount of money per month to have a special check mark next to their name, or they are the CEO and they just publish, or the owner and CTO, just hypothetically speaking, not pointing any fingers here. They might change the ranking model such that everybody sees everything that they post, and a non-trivial number of their posts are, oh, this billionaire tax is it's bad.
Outrage can pose a challenge to the status quo And that can be good, especially on issues like climate change, where the status quo needs to change for our collective survival. Still, changes to the status quo can be negative, and even if the change isn't necessarily bad, the process of changing can be dangerous and painful. People are generally prone to status quo bias, which is a preference for keeping things as they are, even over and above what is rational. Even with all their talk of disruption, in my opinion, your average tech company is much more pro status quo in an economic and political sense than your average person, and they have good reason to be. If they're big and powerful, they've done okay out of the status quo, and social media companies are beholden to the companies that advertise on their sites and governments that can regulate them, both of which tend to favor the status quo. Not a lot of governments looking to foment revolution or even nonviolent mass movements against themselves. And the only radical change most companies would want would be people deciding to buy radically more of their stuff. And of course, social media companies are not only beholden to the governments of the countries they're based in, but also every country in which they wish to operate.
Stories I can't go into a whole lot of depth in, but if you dig around, there are some public records about large social media companies that are really motivated to increase their user base. And many of them, they look at different countries around the world and like, oh, there's a really big one in the East that has over 1 billion people in it. And it'd be real nice if we could have an extra billion users. So you can imagine like that CEOs of those companies, they might try to do things to curry favor with the leadership in these governments that might have or might currently have or have had bans on those programs. So I mean, it's certainly a very complicated issue because it's like, well, you have like a U.S. company that might want to operate in China or Russia or somewhere, and it's not just like, oh, hey, we have this cool software, we have this cool game, we have this a messaging service, and it's not just that, because there's also these geopolitical tensions and like the things that are sometimes like state sanctioned, or like the CIA has like different designations for different groups, and you're not allowed to like pay money to people in certain countries. So I think even like YouTube's monetization program doesn't like it's not available to people that live in certain state sanctioned or some sanctioned countries, because like the US forbids transferring money to people that live in those countries. So it's a very complicated geopolitical story when you have these these platforms that are not country based, but they are headquartered and primarily operating out of a particular country.
Okay, that was a lot of important and hopefully really interesting digression, but let's go back to what trends in terms of political and activist content online and what people think about that. Polarizing content tends to be more popular on social media. Now, I've got a lot of thoughts on polarization, about 30 minutes and 4 seconds worth, given my recent video on the topic. I tend not to treat polarization as some ultimate evil. I care more about political outcomes than political discourse, but still, I'll admit that polarization is bad overall. Treating social media as the primary culprit doesn't make sense to me. It's not like polarization never existed before social media. We did have a civil war after all. But still, the fact that polarizing content disproportionately trends on social media is concerning. Rathje, Van Bavel, and van der Linden studied Facebook posts and tweets from members of the US Congress and found that posts about political outgroups were shared or retweeted about twice as often as posts about the in-group. Unsurprisingly, posts about the in-group received more positive reactions, and posts about the outgroup received more angry reactions. These effects were the same across parties, so it's not even that people like their own political group. They do that, but even more so, they dislike the opposition. And that's what goes viral. This isn't just polarization, it is specifically negative partisanship, meaning that the thing keeping the political parties together is hatred of the other team. Voting against the other side rather than for your own, feeling like you are constantly choosing the lesser of two evils. I really don't like having politics feel or work that way. But I don't think some sort of enforced social media positivity would really help with this much. But I would like our politicians to feel more obligated to offer a useful plan of action, not just a promise to block the other guy. There's absolutely no reason that there is a picture of Joe Biden on the screen right now. This section was written prior to Biden dropping out of the race. I'm keeping it because it's still a good example. Yes, my production schedule really has been that slow for this video. I had to take a break in the middle of writing this script for my own wedding. I know, I have terrible priorities. Hopefully, you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. Back to the topic, I'm not about to stop being critical of Republicans in the hopes that it'll make Democrats do more about climate change or poverty. I guess I just wish that the Republicans were less hateable so the Democrats had to be better. Apologies, this is a bit of a digression, but basically what I'm saying is that negativity about the outgroup tends to go more viral on social media, and that's not great overall, but not necessarily bad in all cases. Maybe it's more of a reflection of people than it is of social media. Please also note that all political opinions expressed here are my own and do not represent the views of my guest. Still, I think it's important to realize that social media companies' goal is not polarization. The goal is to sell us dropship t-shirts about badass fisherman uncles born in June, or whatever else advertises on their platforms. Rath G. Robertson, Brady, and Van Babel did this really interesting study where they asked Americans what they thought goes viral on social media. Importantly, they were not just asking about political content or content from activists, but a lot of this is straightforwardly relevant to that context. Americans tend to think that intensely emotional content, both negative and positive, but negative more so than positive, polarizing content, moral outrage, conspiracy theories, people criticizing their enemies, and hateful content are more likely to go viral. With the exception of content that evokes positive emotions, the Americans surveyed do not generally think this content should go viral. Social media companies also acknowledge, at least on occasion, that very problematic content does have a tendency to go viral.
In 2018, Mark Zuckerberg, in his statement on platform governance, actually spelled this phenomenon out, because it happens. It's been happening on Facebook for a long time, and it happens everywhere else that we see that these types of engagement-based ranking models are used. And the essence of this is, the closer something gets to the line of being like against the rules or violating, the more likely it is that people are going to engage with it.
It is reassuring that most people on both sides of the aisle don't want conspiracy theories or hateful content going viral. Although Republicans seem less concerned about misinformation than Democrats, which is disappointing but unsurprising, because Republicans do tend to share more misinformation online. Still, there is significant agreement overall on what should and shouldn't go viral. This raises two questions. Can we all agree on what hateful, polarizing, conspiracy, misinformation content even is? And if platforms only showed people what they claim they want to see, rather than the things that they pay the most attention to, would those platforms still be profitable? Would they still operate even? Let's start with the first question of whether people actually agree or disagree about what sort of content is really harmful online in a political context. I'll say I'm not super convinced that there's a really strong consensus. I mean, I've heard people say that being overly critical of what I would consider hate content is in fact polarizing because you're refusing to engage with the other side. So this is complicated and controversial stuff. And this video is not about why I'm not going back on that one broy dude's podcast. Also, yes, I used AI for this image on the screen right now because a ton of these types of podcasts have AI generated thumbnails, a helpful little red flag for anyone else who's also deciding what podcasts are worth their time to go on. According to Rasmussen in 2022, Democrats and Republicans both disapprove of speech that sounds hateful with no target group specified pretty equally. But Democrats and left wingers are more willing to support restricting hate speech that targets certain groups like Black people or Muslims, whereas more right leaning people tend to focus on the severity of the speech rather than the target. Still, the severity of the speech also matters a great deal to Democrats, so a severity based approach might have more bipartisan support. But ignoring what groups are affected and how in making corporate or governmental policies seems impractical and as if it might lead to bizarre situations, like treating the word cracker as the same as the N-word. Sure, they're both insulting terms based on ethnicity, but the historical weight and connection to material harms and injustice is just so vastly different. I don't think I can really cover this issue well here, but I do suggest the article on the screen right now, whose title I am not sure I can read on YouTube. Not the first time I've had to censor the name of an academic article for a YouTube video. For my video on sexual preferences across the political spectrum, I had to move my whole citation list to an external Google Doc. Man, algorithms are dumb. Sometimes it depends what sort of prioritized from an algorithmic perspective, but that's very important to keep in mind while talking about things like social media moderation. Now, on to that second question. We cannot ignore the fact that the content we claim that we don't want to see does capture our attention. Capturing our attention so it can be redirected into selling us products is how all large social media companies make their money. Well, except for selling blue checks, but that doesn't actually seem to be going great from like a business perspective. So, is it even possible for us to be shown less attention grabbing stuff that we claim not to like with the profit motive still in place? Well, let's check in with our expert.
There are some studies that have been done where hypothetically we might have asked people, like, what do you want to see on the platform? And they will say some of the things that they dislike the most are divisive, toxic, hostile content, things that attack them, things that are misleading or misinformation. People say that they hate that stuff. They don't want that stuff. They don't like that stuff. Yet, that's the stuff that they engage with most. So there's a mixed signal there. And because these algorithms that decide the order in which the content is presented to you are premised on, like, okay, what are the pieces of content that this person is most likely to engage with? Not, is it like, what pieces of content is this person most likely to get value from, or to find high quality, or to find to be informative or useful in some way? That stuff, like, some places have that in the model somewhere, but it's many times weaker as an input than things like, oh, what's the probability of Abby clicking on this post, or liking this post, or resharing this post, or commenting on it? And the more you do those things with that post, or with posts like that, the more the algorithm's like, oh yeah, it's essentially, you could think of it like patting them on, like being pat on the head. So the algorithm is a happy little dog, a little Labrador, just wants to please you, and it keeps bringing you things. And if you pat it on the head when it brings you, I don't know, a dead rat or something, it's going to keep bringing you more of those. And that's essentially what we're doing with social media. We go on Facebook, we go on Instagram, we go on TikTok, we go wherever, and then it shows us this upsetting thing, and then maybe we use an anger reaction, or we write a comment and say, "Oh, this is the worst. You're evil," and then the algorithm takes that as like, "Oh, you want more? That's what you're telling me. Okay, we can do that." And then the next time you log in, you see 2 or 3 or 4 posts that are just like that, because as dumb as these algorithms are, they're also really, really smart, because they have so much data on you that they're very good at like understanding and predicting the things that you're going to engage with.
I'm wondering whether you think that there's ever going to be sort of a viable alternative for social media, especially social media used for political discussion and stuff, something that isn't owned by a profit-motivated corporation, something that's more community or governmentally, though governmentally has its own extreme set of baggage, controlled, sort of whether you see any potential there.
So I think the safe bet when it comes to anything regarding technology is that, yes, it's going to change. We don't necessarily know what that next thing is going to be. Over the last couple of years, as people's sentiment towards some of the old guard massive social media platforms has soured, where the public doesn't trust most of the social media companies or even the big tech companies now. And they actively dislike using, they say that they dislike using these platforms, yet they're, perhaps because the platforms are so big, they can't help but use them. But with the growing negative sentiment and negative experiences that people are having on these platforms, there is like a pretty big thirst for something different and something better. Now, in the last couple of years, there have been, I don't know, probably dozens of small startup attempts to essentially provide an alternative to Twitter, to Facebook. And some of those, they went belly up pretty quickly. The creator, I know some of the creators of them, and their hearts are in the right place, but sometimes you need you have to, there's some very difficult challenges that have to be balanced in terms of trying to come up with a way to make a platform that shows people the stuff that they want to see and that they engage with and is useful and valuable to them. But not show them the stuff that will cause them to spend a lot of time on your platform, which is good for the monetary status of the company or the platform, but maybe not so good for society, maybe not so good for the users in the long run. So there's certainly an appetite for it. A number of the attempts kind of have failed. There are some that are still going strong, and there's a lot of interest in Mastodon after Elon Musk bought Twitter. That it hasn't grown that much. It's grown in the last 2 years, but it's also clunky and kind of confusing. I do think that there's going to be a change, and a lot of the decisions that these companies are making are further stilting in the direction of their eventual collapse, because there are some studies that have been done inside several of these companies that look at the long-term benefits of having dedicated trust and safety staff and really leaning into efforts that are geared to keeping people safe online. And people that are getting the greater safety protections online, they tend to in the short run, they tend to engage less with the platform, but in the long run, they engage more. Now, this is because of a thing called network effects. And when you launch a change into how a social network works, or how an algorithm within a social network works, what happens is the math behind your feed changes, but it like you're not going to see the full effect of, say, demoting, I don't know, like bullying or harassment or like insert negative harmful thing here. Like you're not going to see the full effect of that immediately, because it's not just like, oh, what do I see today or tomorrow? It's like how seeing slightly less of that over time changes the norms in the space that you're operating. So with these companies being more blasé towards trust and safety and being and laying off many of their trust and safety experts, they are creating spaces where these harmful experiences can thrive. And since the layoffs, you've seen a number of exposés, particularly around like child sexual abuse material. Like, and earlier this year there were the Senate hearings about it, but a lot of really harmful things have been percolating and coming to light since the layoffs, because the people that are experts in dealing with kind of some of the worst stuff you can imagine are not there anymore. And
so you brought up a really interesting thing when we were having initial conversations about this project, which is that a bunch of platforms are sort of decreasing the visibility of political content in general.
For some reason, over the last few years, many social media platforms have been trying to get out of the politics business, which is sort of confusing because it's like one of the things that people care most about on those platforms and engage most with on those platforms. So it's a risky endeavor in terms of participation and time spent and all the things that add up to more dollars for the companies. But it's an area of subtopic, or it's a topic of content that is not without risk, because some platforms that have been known for being very political places, like Facebook and Twitter, like they've gotten into trouble over political activities on their platforms. The number of bad PR stories that have come out from some of the bad things that political content or political stuff on Facebook and Twitter have been implicated in have been great. So like the military in Myanmar was using Facebook to facilitate a genocide. There are like other groups that have facilitated like persecuting minorities or political dissidents through social media. So like, and like Cambridge Analytica was like it's like the actual project that went into that was not like expressly political. It was a personality survey that a social psychologist built. And because we're social beings, when we saw like, oh, our friend just took a personality quiz and I can see how similar I am to them. I can see what my personality is. And then I can also see how compatible I am with them. Like, oh my goodness, I've got to do that. So of course, like millions, I think it was like, I think it was like 500,000 people, at least in some of the data sets, completed that survey. But the thing that wasn't really so explicit at the point was like the connection of your survey responses there with all of your behavior on platform. And nobody that like gave like arguably informed consent, but they gave consent to participate in the personality survey. They did not give consent to have that data sold to this analytics company that ended up using it to help elect Donald Trump. So that, and there was also like illegal transfer of data, and they held data after saying it was deleted, and like there were all kinds of like violations there. But I think that the public memory of it is that, oh, Cambridge Analytica is the thing that Facebook did that helped Donald Trump get elected. And And in doing so, they violated my privacy. So
Yeah.
that's that's one instance where a very overtly political thing caused the platform to suffer, both in terms of like the sentiment towards the platform, but also like there are legal fines that come with some of these problems. Facebook was built or fined $5 billion by the FTC for not protecting privacy in the way that they said that they were. And now some of the newer legislation, like the Digital Services Act in the EU, come with penalties where if a company is deemed to be non-compliant with the Digital Services Act, they can be fined up to 6% of their global revenue, not 6% of their profits, not 6% of their revenue from the country or region that they're in, but the entire global revenue. So,
okay, that's a lot.
Yes, that is a lot. And that could be like many billions of dollars. That's not anything to sneeze at. So that's enough to put some companies out of business because some of their margins are so low. Like X, formerly known as Twitter, their profits or their earnings, I think, are down like about 55-58% since Musk took over, and they were profitable, but not super profitable, not like some of these platforms beforehand, and now like they're even worse. So
yeah,
if they were to get some massive fine, then that like I think instead of paying the fine, they would probably just have to agree to stop operating in the European Union, and that's like that becomes a real risk for some of these platforms that are just not profitable enough. And like and X is a unique example too, because just this week Brazil banned the use of X in Brazil because of failure to comply with local laws. Now, who knows if they'll go back online, but it right now it seems like they're not taking action to try to get back into compliance. So at some point, these platforms, they have to either follow the rules, pay the price for not following the rules, or they just say, this country isn't big enough or wealthy enough for us to justify having however many subject matter experts in that country or whatever infrastructure is necessary to be compliant in that country.
Yeah, I don't know how big Twitter was in Brazil, but Brazil has a huge population. Do you think that social media companies should be, as you put it, in the politics business?
Like some of these are private companies. Like Elon Musk, he owns, he and like some co-investors and banks, they own X.
Some of whom are national governments, right? Or sovereign wealth funds?
Yes. But not the U.S.
No, not the U.S.
I
think it's some of the oil-rich Middle Eastern ones, but I don't want to get the country wrong.
Yeah. So, in the case of a private platform, like your owner can dictate, like, okay, this is the kind of stuff that you'll see on this platform. But when it's a public platform, and it's publicly owned, like a lot of the ones that are publicly traded, it's trickier because the founder and CEO might only own like 20% of the company in terms of the shares. So like they don't even own the majority of them. So like who really should be deciding like what's on there? And it's also kind of weird to think about when like the company's making public statements like, oh, we want to be a platform where people can come and get what they want. They can find people that they want to connect with, they want to build community with, and give them the power to really do that. But that is But now, if that same company is trying to get out of the politics business, what's happening is they say, okay, well, yeah, you can build community. It just can't be related to the local fire department. It can't be related to public schools. It can't be related to any major political party. It can't be related to any of these things that are potentially, can't be related to CDC or health, like, because all of these
or
things
any
are kind of
identity
wrapped
group,
up.
just about.
Exactly. So they say, oh yeah, you should come here and feel free to express your authentic self. Just don't be so authentic about most things that matter. You can only be authentic with your cat memes.
And let me tell you from my cat fostering experiences, there are people who get very polarized about issues to do with cats. I had a conversation with a lady at a cat adoption event. We were all talking about whether or not we would cut off a family member if they got a cat from a breeder.
Viable.
Yeah.
Same with dogs. I have a dog. I'm big on adopt. Don't.
Yeah, me too. I don't think I'd cut off a family member for it, but yeah, no, but I am definitely an adopt don't shop person, especially from my experiences like fostering cats. So it turns out that a lot of social media companies are decreasing the reach of political content in general. This is probably an oversimplification, but algorithmically this basically works by multiplying the post's normal reach by a number less than 1. Here are Matt's thoughts on whether or not that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's so I think that it's challenging to say whether a company should or should not be doing that. I think that there's certainly content that should be demoted or promoted, but it's very hard to kind of define, like, well, what is broadly good and broadly bad, what should be promoted versus demoted. And I think that, like, you can find some areas where there's probably close to universal agreement, like, okay, so if something is like terrorist recruitment material or like child sexual exploitation, like that stuff, I would say that probably north of like 95% of people would say yes, actively demote that, or remove it if you can, just like get rid of it. But when it comes to things like health content, like, should I take hydroxychloroquine for COVID? Like the medical science out there on it is very clear. Like, it doesn't do anything to protect you from COVID. It doesn't cure COVID. Like, none of that bears out in the data. But should you be demoting someone's speech because that's what they're saying? Like, my bias is, yes, you should demote that. But I also recognize that is a value of mine. Like, I prioritize scientific data over like these personal opinions that could be life-threatening. So, but that's a bias that I recognize that I have and that I'm expressing that I have. So, like, I think that stuff that's dangerous should certainly be demoted and shown to as few people as possible if it just can't be removed from the platform outright. But like the problem that emerges is when you're dealing with these things that are less clear cut than like terrorist recruitment or like porn, you start seeing these arguments of people saying, oh, well, you're biased against conservatives, or you're biased against liberals, or you're censoring my free speech. And there's like that is it's a really complicated issue, and you can like try to assess each of those pieces, like, all right, well, if platforms are biased against conservatives, then one way to determine whether that is true is looking at what content gets the most views on platforms, what content gets the most engagement on those platforms. And like Facebook, and so Facebook releases this widely viewed content report every quarter, and in it they show the top 20 most engaged with links that people share, and the top 20 most engaged with accounts and pages and these kinds of things. And historically, like many of those accounts are conservative ones.
Yeah.
And like conservative news gets circulated more online than liberal news. And you could come up with lots of stories for that. But if someone is saying, oh, these platforms are biased against conservatives, you have to ask the question of, well, if they're biased against conservatives, then why is conservative stuff viewed so much more often than liberal stuff?
Yeah.
So like that's hard.
Yeah, but I'm getting the sense that you sort of want it treated as more of a nuanced issue rather than demoting all political content.
Oh yeah, like
yeah.
I'm wishing that there's some document. So a lot of the stuff that I've talked about from Meta it was included in document dumps from like Frances Haugen when she went to SEC and blew the whistle on Facebook and went on 60 Minutes and testified in front of Congress and all that. So much of that has been leaked, but there's a lot of other stuff that I'm like now I'm like, oh man, I remember seeing this study. It'd be real nice if that was out there, because then I could talk about it.
I know this video is crazy long, but I do want to briefly touch on this tendency I see among leftists to see TikTok as somehow better or more of a threat to the status quo. Well, TikTok is different from other social media sites, or at least most of them, in that it's not based in the US. So one could make a case that its corporate interests are less tied with US hegemony. TikTok does also seem to have a lot of opportunities for creativity and shared symbols that make it useful to activists, perhaps even over and above other social media. How different social media sites vary in how they facilitate activism and what sorts they facilitate could probably be its own video. Anyway, I would be really cautious against treating TikTok as some sort of social media savior, because they too have downplayed valuable activism. For example, in 2020, they downplayed videos from Black activists using the BLM hashtag. I should say, though, that I really don't think TikTok is any worse than any other social media. And its singling out by the US government is not something I support. I personally support far more regulation for all social media. Social media corporations are not terribly interested in being ideal tools for positive activism, although some of their employees may be invested in creating good platforms for political discourse. Unfortunately, according to Matt, that's getting worse.
Everybody that was on my team was laid off, and the most of the people that I worked closely with that were super passionate in terms of like trying to combat these harms, many of them they were laid off. Though many of the ones who were not laid off, they had kind of become company people, and they're like, oh well, yeah, it'd be nice if we could get rid of that, but that doesn't help my promotion case. That's not going to increase my bonus. But it reduces views on hate speech by 500,000 views a day. No, but that's not going to help me with my bonus or promotion, because that's my team isn't like that. My team's remit is not reducing that. So again, there's a lot going on with kind of the infrastructure or the organizational structure that leads people there to operate in ways that are better for them individually, but not necessarily better for the end user. And since 23,000 plus people from Meta were laid off, and 50-60% of Twitter were laid off, the people that I know that work in these places, they say, like, even the people that are really passionate about like protecting users against some of these harms, they now feel like they have to walk on eggshells and they're not that committed to anything because like the companies are kind of chaotic, and like it's not like there used to be security in the job, and you could realize like, oh, okay, so if I don't perform if I don't perform, if I don't exceed my expectations based on a matrix of things that I'm supposed to do, then like I would have a chance to like improve my performance over time. But like increasingly there's an anxiety that many of these people that I talk to feel, and it causes them to take less risks and push less hard for some of these really important issues that need to be addressed, but are also like delicate, challenging issues that might be expensive to work on, might require like more content moderation. It might require like all kinds of things. So I don't know for certain, but I can say that there's a lot more anxiety in these companies. Like gone are the days of like going in and being all happy-go-lucky playing ping pong and such as you eat from the free kitchens with the delicious food.
Of course, activists find ways to adapt platforms for their own ends. This can be things like using third party programs to be able to make more information focused Instagram posts like infographics. Activists can also do things more deliberately designed to avoid censorship and cater to algorithms, such as couching political statements as makeup routines, a trend on TikTok that's been popular among activists calling out the mistreatment of Uyghurs and more recently Palestinians. Essentially, social media is not built or maintained to be a tool for activists, but a wrench isn't made to hammer a nail. But it still works in a pinch. I found that out when we needed to hang a picture, and I don't know where our hammer has gone. Anyway, is social media activism good for the world overall? Well, I don't know. Social media does perhaps favor certain ways of expressing political views that are not ideal. Anger, outgroup negativity, that sort of thing. But honestly, I think I could make a case that pamphlet sales 300 years ago favored the same things. That doesn't mean that better discourse and moderation is impossible, just that social media might be more a new vehicle for an old problem here. What strikes me as more unique is the way the algorithm can be made to downplay politics even if the users are interested in it. A private company does have the right to focus its platform on whatever it wants. If Facebook's leadership decided tomorrow that everyone was only going to be shown different AI generated pictures of shrimp Jesus forever, legally they could do that. Still, do we want these private companies having so much control of the public discourse, especially given how much corporate interests and that of the everyday person are increasingly diverging? Well, there have been some proposed public options for social media, specifically in the EU. They've got a slick website with a couple of articles, but no way to even beta test the product. So I think we are a while away from democratically controlled social media being the norm, even if it is a worthy goal. Even if social media were a bad thing overall, which I don't really think, that doesn't necessarily mean that activists shouldn't utilize it. Social media can be useful to activists, but there is a time and effort commitment involved, and the payoff is likely to vary by all sorts of factors, like cause and location, as well as what platform you are using. So I'm not going to say that all activists should be on social media, and certainly I'm not going to say that all activists need to be on all social media. I'll add as a little addendum that after the election, the climate organization that I volunteer with was able to do a lot of volunteer recruitment via social media. That has sort of changed my perspective in making this video because I was able to really see like a very clear example of okay, these are people who we were able to get involved in our cause in a positive way that we wouldn't have been able to or would have been less likely to without social media. However, at the same time, we're like, okay, our content isn't getting any play on Twitter, and the way Twitter is being run really conflicts with our values as an organization. So at the same time that we're seeing increased returns on our social media activism, we're also deciding to leave Twitter. And I think a lot of activist organizations and individuals are going to be making similar calculations to that in the coming months and years. All right. I really want to thank my patrons here. You guys have been so patient, and I really, really, really appreciate it. I promise the next video will not take this long to come out. This one took a while for a number of reasons, including planning my wedding and some health issues. Nothing major. Don't worry about me. And also, having to find a time to get Matt to sit down. Huge thank you to Matt for donating this much of his time to tell us all about this stuff. You should go check out his channel. His channel is called Unmoderated Insights. I also really want to thank my friend Sedona for sitting through and giving me notes on a painfully early draft of this video. This video also took a while because I have never edited 2 hours of interview footage into a smaller amount of interview footage and integrated into a video before. That is so much work that I did not anticipate. Thank you so much for your patience. The next video should be out in a much shorter period of time.